The boardroom fell silent as Marcus Chen's phone buzzed for the third time. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows of Chen Industries' Manhattan headquarters, snow fell in thick curtains, blanketing the city in white. He ignored the device, focused on the quarterly projections flickering across the screen, until a small hand tugged at his sleeve. Security should have never allowed a child into the executive suite. Yet there she stood, no more than 7 years old, with dark eyes brimming with tears and snowflakes melting in her tangled hair. Her pink coat was too thin for December, and her shoes left wet prints on the marble floor. "Sir," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the howling wind outside. "My mom didn't come home last night." 20 executives froze, their pens hovering over contracts worth millions. Marcus looked down at the little girl, recognizing something in her desperate expression that made his chest tighten. Without a word, he stood, grabbed his coat, and followed her toward the elevator, leaving behind a room full of shocked faces and unsigned deals. The girl's name was Sofia, and she spoke in fragments as they descended 40 floors. Her mother, Maria, worked as a night janitor in one of the buildings downtown. She always came home by 7 in the morning to make Sofia breakfast before school. But this morning, their small apartment had remained empty and cold. "The neighbors said not to bother anyone," Sofia explained, wiping her nose with her sleeve. "But I saw your picture in Mama's magazine. She said you used to be poor like us before you became important. I thought maybe you'd remember what it's like." Marcus's jaw clenched. 20 years had passed since he'd left poverty behind, since he'd clawed his way from a cramped Chinatown apartment to the top floor of his own skyscraper. He'd almost forgotten the terror of uncertainty, the hollow ache of hunger, the desperate helplessness of having no one to turn to. His driver started to open the limousine door, but Marcus shook his head. "Which building?" he asked Sofia. 3 blocks that way," she pointed east, toward the older part of the financial district where the Christmas lights seemed dimmer and the streets less traveled. They walked. The snow stung Marcus's face, soaking through his expensive Italian shoes. Sofia's hand felt impossibly small in his, as she led him through alleys he'd never noticed despite working in this neighborhood for a decade. Behind the gleaming towers of wealth stood forgotten buildings with flickering lights and cracked windows, invisible to those who didn't need to see them. The building's lobby smelled of disinfectant and damp concrete. The elevator was broken, so they climbed 7 flights of stairs. Sofia's breathing grew labored, and Marcus realized she probably hadn't eaten since yesterday. At the 5th floor, they encountered a security guard, an older man with kind eyes who recognized Sofia immediately. "Your mama's not here, sweetheart," he said gently. "She never showed up for her shift last night. We called, but her phone went straight to voicemail." A cold dread settled in Marcus's stomach, having nothing to do with the temperature. He pulled out his phone and called his head of security. "I need you to trace someone." "Maria," he looked at Sofia. "Rodriguez," the girl supplied. "Maria Elena Rodriguez." Within minutes, his security team was working with the police, tracking Maria's last known location through her transit card. Marcus bought Sofia a hot chocolate from a bodega across the street and watched her wrap her frozen fingers around the cup. His phone rang continuously. His assistant, his board members, his investors all wondering where he'd disappeared to. He silenced them all. "Mr. Chen?" His head of security's voice was tight. "We found something. Her transit card was last used at a station in Brooklyn at 6:15 this morning. There's a report of a woman matching her description who collapsed on the platform. She was taken to Kings County Hospital." Marcus grabbed Sofia's hand. "Come on." His driver had finally caught up with them, and the limousine cut through the snow-choked streets with urgency. Sofia sat rigid beside Marcus, her hot chocolate forgotten, her small face pale with fear. He found himself talking to her, sharing stories he'd buried for decades, about his own mother who'd worked 3 jobs, about the nights he'd waited by the window wondering if she'd make it home safely, about the constant fear that shadowed every moment of his childhood. "Your mother is strong," he told Sofia, "just like you." The hospital's emergency room was chaos. Marcus bypassed the waiting area, his name and position opening doors that remained closed to so many others. He felt the weight of that privilege like stones in his pockets as Sofia clutched his hand tighter. They found Maria in a recovery room, conscious but weak. Severe hypoglycemia, the doctor explained. She'd been skipping meals to save money for Sofia's Christmas presents, working double shifts to afford a warm winter coat for her daughter. She'd fainted on the subway platform, hitting her head. If a kind stranger hadn't called 911, if she'd fallen onto the tracks instead of the platform. Maria's eyes widened when she saw her daughter, then filled with tears of relief and shame. "Sofia, I told you never to bother strangers." "Sir, I'm so sorry." "Don't." Marcus's voice was rough. "Your daughter is remarkably brave and resourceful. She saved your life by finding help." He stepped outside while they reunited, giving them privacy while making phone calls that would change their circumstances. His foundation could provide emergency assistance. His company needed dedicated employees. Maria's work ethic was exactly what he valued. The building where she'd worked as a janitor was actually owned by one of his subsidiaries. He'd had no idea of the conditions there. The lack of benefits, the poverty wages that forced parents to choose between feeding themselves and feeding their children. How many others were invisible to him, working in the shadows of his success? When Marcus returned to the room, Sofia was curled against her mother's side, both of them crying softly. He cleared his throat, suddenly aware of how out of place. He looked in his designer suit amid the sterile hospital walls. "Mrs. Rodriguez, my company has positions available in our corporate facilities department. Full benefits, living wage, normal hours. If you're interested, the job is yours once you've recovered." Maria stared at him, disbelief written across her exhausted face. "Why would you do this?" "You don't know us." Marcus glanced at Sofia, who'd fallen asleep against her mother's shoulder, her small face finally peaceful. "Because someone once gave me a chance when I had nothing. Because your daughter reminded me that success means nothing if we forget where we came from. Because it's the right thing to do." That night, after ensuring Maria and Sofia had everything they needed, Marcus returned to his office. The building was empty, the snowstorm having sent everyone home hours ago. He stood at his window looking down at the city blanketed in white, seeing it differently now. How many Sofias were out there? Their mothers working invisible jobs, their lives precarious and uncertain. The next morning, he called an emergency board meeting, not to discuss quarterly profits or expansion plans, but to propose a complete overhaul of their employment practices. Minimum wage increases for all contracted workers, healthcare benefits, emergency funds for employees facing hardship. Some board members protested, citing costs and shareholders. Marcus listened, then told them about a 7-year-old girl who'd walked through a snowstorm to save her mother's life. "We can afford this," he said quietly. "The question is, can we afford not to?" 6 months later, Marcus attended Sofia's 8th birthday party in the Rodriguez family's new apartment, modest but warm, in a safe neighborhood with good schools. Maria had thrived in her new position, her steady income allowing Sofia to join the soccer team she'd always dreamed of. The little girl who'd whispered desperately in a boardroom now laughed with friends, her future no longer shadowed by constant uncertainty. As Marcus prepared to leave, Sofia ran up to him with a drawing she'd made, a man in a suit holding hands with a little girl, walking through snow toward a bright sun. At the bottom, in careful letters, she'd written, "Heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they just listen." Marcus kept that drawing in his office, a reminder that the most important decisions aren't always made in boardrooms, that true leadership means seeing the invisible, that one moment of choosing compassion over convenience can change everything. The snowstorm had passed, but its lesson remained, forever altering the course of 3 lives and rippling outward to touch countless others who would benefit from one CEO's choice to rush into the storm rather than turn away.